Welcome to AskBYS Podcast, a monthly podcast brought to you by Bainbridge Youth Services. AskBYS Podcast connects parents to professionals that can provide support, education, and resources on a particular topic in parenting. My name is Shannon and and I am your host. I am here with Milagro Castilleja as our producer. We are recording live at the Media Arts Studio at Barn, the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network. Today, we are happy to welcome our parent guest, Shannon Taylor, a Bainbridge Island resident, mother of four, and writer and editor.
Thank you for having me.
And our professional guests, Chase Myers, licensed BYS therapist.
Happy to be here.
And Helen Burke, licensed BYS therapist with her own private practice.
Excited to be here today.
Thank you all. Today's episode is Connecting Parents with Therapists of Adolescents and Teens, and we invite you to listen in on this conversation between Shannon, Chase, and Helen.
Okay, I'm going to jump right in here.
That's good.
Great.
So, what kinds of behaviors and effects are we seeing post-COVID? I remember when students first went back to school, hearing that a lot of them struggled with not being masters of their own schedule anymore. For example, having to sit through a long class when, during the Zoom days, they would have finished the work in 10 minutes. Are students adjusting to normal life again, whatever that means, or have some things permanently changed for them?
Yeah, I can jump in first.
Yeah, go for it.
If you don't mind, Helen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it really touches on a lot of what we're all going through, I think, with just this, how do we get back to normal coming out of the pandemic? And we're definitely seeing that with the kids as this kind of desire for stability and this need for routine really popping up. And I would say, at least my belief in that is that there really isn't a return to normal as the way we used to know it. For a couple of years, the rules didn't apply at all, and kids are very perceptive. They when we go from saying, because I said so for a lot of things, and then because I said so didn't really apply for a while. So trying to get back to that mentality has been a little difficult for all of us. And I see some problems in trying to force that return. To your point, I think a lot of kids had that really enjoyed that flexibility of finding a new path for themselves and finding new things that work. And I kind of believe we should encourage that and kind of use this as an opportunity to trim the fat and what worked during that time, and how can we encourage that going forward? How can we kind of develop a new normal? I don't know if you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a crazy few years, and I think that kids are they're different. We're all different, than we were 3 years ago, and there's not really going back to normal. And I think normal itself is kind of normal, abnormal, right, wrong, right? Like there's really just who's your kid? You know your kid better than anyone. So trusting yourself in terms of noticing if something really seems out of character for your kid, or if they're really struggling with something. And I think sometimes we have our own anxieties as parents about, is my kid okay, basically. So some of it is just managing that anxiety. I talk to kids who their social anxiety went way down during the pandemic because they didn't have to interact. So there were things that they liked about it that made it hard to go back. Other kids really felt like online learning was just not possible almost, and it felt lonely. So the range of experiences really depends on the kid's personality and the family and what the classes were like. So I don't know that there's a going back to normal, but there is a acceptance of here we are now. So what can we do here?
Well, it's interesting because as you're talking, there's an assumption maybe that there's just negative things that happen, but can you think of anything that's been a positive change as a result?
I would say this is going to be something they're going to draw on, like, I got through that.
Yeah.
How about you, Chase?
There's some resilience. I'll just say one thing that I'm seeing is this kind of, this focus on mental health and really working on themselves and kind of using that resilience to grow through this time. I'm definitely seeing kids really wanting to prioritize. They see how chaotic the world can be, and this really highlighted that for them, and I think it's really helped them want to work on themselves and kind of grow and be better people through it. So,
and figure out how they can make a difference.
Yeah.
Well, and one thing, just at one point with all 6 of us there and 2 dogs and a cat, I don't think that I will feel guilty about not having spent time with my kids going forward. So that, check that box off.
Yes,
lots of time together.
A lot of time together. And maybe valuing in a different way in-person contact when we couldn't have it.
Yeah.
And so much of what we do is online, but we really came to value that. Wow, it's really, to be sitting in a room together even right now,
Right.
I think, wow, we're so lucky. Yeah.
When I first moved to the island 6 years ago, I worked with a little guy who was about 8 who kept referring to his anxiety. And I'd never heard a child use that phrase, really. And part of me thought it was amazing that he'd been given the vocabulary to express his feelings. But another part of me wondered if he was in any way limiting himself. How can we as parents know the difference so we can help our kids?
I think that's a really good question. And I think, so what I hear in that is this really good vocabulary, or is this a limiting label? If I'm going to sort of, does that, yeah. So, and I think it's both. It can be both. It has the potential to be both. I think that some of the great things about words like anxiety and depression becoming more used and more normalized is that it's normalized, right? That it's not, it's destigmatizing it, and it becomes part of everyday conversation sometimes. And so we have words. It's helpful to have words to describe how we're feeling. Anxiety is such a human experience, right? It's like our human alert system. So I went to the high school and talked to all the freshman health classes this year. And one of the questions I asked the kids was, raise your hand if you've never experienced anxiety and you have no idea what I'm talking about. Nobody raised their hands. And even in this room, has anybody here never experienced anxiety? I mean, yeah, no hands are up. So it's how we survive. So some anxiety makes sense. And when we're in a stressful situation, anxiety can sometimes even be helpful. It depends on how it impacts us. And then in terms of, let's say, a diagnosis, right? Is a diagnosis helpful? It can be really helpful for people to realize that they are experiencing the same collection of symptoms that other people experience, and so they feel less alone. It can help them get the right treatment, the right intervention. It helps get insurance to pay for those treatments. And then just that normalizing it. So there's some really positive things about that. And then I think there's also potential for it being limiting, right? So if I say, well, I can't do that because I have anxiety, and it's keeping us from, or our kids from doing things they want to do, it's like, no, I can't, I have anxiety. And a way of thinking about it is like the difference between the sentence, I am anxious, versus I feel anxious, right? I am not anxiety. Right. I think sometimes it can become a part of our identity that we think is unchangeable, and it can be limiting. Is this making sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and it was, as he was talking, this 8-year-old, it was almost as though the anxiety was, I just pictured it, like this little gremlin-y thing.
Yes.
But the idea of separating himself from that he could take that gremlin, acknowledge its existence,
right,
but then put it on a shelf and get on, with his life and his day. And
yes, right. Yeah. And I think that is such a great, befriending our anxiety, externalizing it. I love that example that you gave. That's something that we do with a lot of clients.
Yeah, it can be really helpful just to make that separation and envision that separation, because it really reminds you who you are opposed to how your feelings are. And as simple as that, just envisioning it can really help create that separation.
So when a student comes to you, you never say, don't feel anxious, or you don't need to feel anxious. Mm-hmm. It's more, well, what's causing that? Or
Well, and one thing, anxiety is a very general word.
Yeah.
And we all experience it slightly differently. So I get really curious about, well, what's anxiety like for you?
And I think this is a good point to add when it comes to vocabulary, because we use vocabulary, especially when it comes to psychology terms. Those have been perforated around the internet a lot lately, and it can be really confusing over what did I just hear and it sounds right to me versus how do I actually feel. So I see any conversation like this as a good opportunity for both parents and the children to kind of take a step back and learn. Okay, you're saying you feel anxious. What does that look like to you, to Helen's point, and how can we define that in a way that's really accurate to how you feel? And maybe it is something else. Maybe you are feeling a different way, and this can be that opportunity to kind of explore that together and talk about it together.
Mm-hmm. And so the idea, too, can become that that feeling might be telling you this is something you really don't want to do. It's not because you're afraid to do it. It's that, this isn't me. This isn't who I want to be.
Yeah, it's a way to explore. And I think I just want to say and call myself out, as families and as parents and as a culture, how we use these words is really important. And I think I said at the beginning, we've had a crazy few years, right? Like words like crazy, bipolar, I'm just so depressed is sometimes used in a way that can minimize or stigmatize. So thinking about as parents and our families, how we're using language is really important, because obviously our kids are picking up on it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that ties into this question I had about, at a recent holiday gathering on the island, I met a nationally competitive athlete, a doctor who worked with Dr. Fauci to help manage the AIDS crisis in America, like literally helped us get through that in the 80s, and a retired executive who helped build Amazon into what it is today. And that sort of thing happens all the time here. We have a lot of high achievers here, so how do we honor achievement while also giving room to not have to be good at everything? Sometimes I think we assume that striving to reach goals stresses kids out, but I'd argue that maybe not striving stresses some kids out. And what made me think of that in relation to the pandemic was I remember shortly after we were kind of getting back to a normal schedule, and there was a mom who reached out. She was really concerned about her kids and having to go back to sports and practice every day after school, whereas my youngest, she was so looking forward to that. Like for her, that was something that schedule, that normalcy, and how do we, what's good for one kid, what might look like achievement may not really be the same thing for another kid, whether they're reading early or reading late. There's just all these little measures that maybe aren't little benchmarks. Yeah. And how do you not hold back that early reader or the kid who wants to get back on the court because you think that might be what they really need?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you're touching on something that as parents, we love our kids so much. And we want them to be okay, and we want them to succeed. And what that looks like, what do we mean when we talk about achievement, right? And I think when they're at school, they're focusing definitely on their intellectual abilities, on their occupational, what do you want to be when you grow up, these sorts of things. And, I think that definitely like at a school like Bainbridge High School, that would be considered a high-achieving school in some of the research that's out there, kids feel a lot of pressure to achieve. They're comparing themselves to their peers on, in real life, on social media. And really, there's so much emphasis on grades and what do you want to be and being, the top athlete on their team. And so when I think about achievement, I just think, what do we mean when we say that? And there's a way of looking at sort of overall well-being, and there are 8 dimensions of these in some models. And so that is like intellectual well-being, social well-being, occupational, like they're students now, but that could move into career, physical well-being, are they in a healthy environment, environmental well-being, spiritual, existential, sort of what, do they feel some sense of meaning and connection in their life? Let's see, financial well-being, and I think that's it. But so we know at school, they're really focusing on the intellectual and the occupational, maybe some of the physical if they're doing sports. So I think about at home, can we focus on some of the other ones, right? Like the social connections, the emotional well-being, how do they understand themselves, and what do we prioritize as parents? And I think that's where it's good for parents to look at what was valued in our families growing up, right? What messages did we get? And then what's the cultural messaging, around this. I don't know. What do you think, Chase?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. That was very well put. I would just add that I think, just coming down from that, the where do kids find their value? Where do they feel valued? And if that's not at school for certain situations, because a lot of the system is telling you that grades are your value, and if you don't have good grades, you don't have value, and kids really, really feel that. And it can leave them feeling very lost and unable to succeed. And then, so not that grades shouldn't be important and they shouldn't be encouraged, but if they have other areas that they feel successful in, that they feel valued in, then it makes that area of life, that academic area of life, just less pressure overall, which can only benefit them in their grades, in their well-being. So I really just see that direct connection between where do you get your value, where do you feel like you are valued, and how well you do. And going back to your point of what is success and what does that success look like for each individual child, each individual family. So encouraging success without allowing that external pressure of success to get too tough. It's not an easy thing to balance. So.
It's not easy. And, I have a friend who said the best thing that ever happened to her daughter was when she got a B. And the world kind of opened up for her because she stopped chasing that, that dream of being valedictorian and did other things, and not to knock valedictorians, it's great, but I think there has to be a piece, and I think that was, hopefully what came across with this idea when I talked to this mom, that I told her for my daughter, that structure, that's where she feels safe. Yeah. She really liked the, just knowing what was expected. She would show up at practice Monday through Friday and knew what was expected. And for her, that was very comforting. Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't as comforting for her kids, so take some time off. You don't have to, sign up again for the sport the second it starts up. It's like if it's important, they'll figure out a way to make it work. But, listen, like you keep saying this, and I think it's so true. It's like, just know your kid.
Yeah. Yeah, and I heard that originally in your question, like your kid was really looking forward to getting back out there. Some kids were dreading it. And so knowing our kids, and a big piece of it is their motivation internal or external, right? And hopefully as they grow, it's really moving more and more internal, because that's really what's going to feel fulfilling and meaningful in their life. Like, am I someone who loves studying and I can't get enough of it, and science is my thing, and I love my teachers and I really feel just motivated to do it? Or am I doing it because of something outside of me, which tends to not be very sustainable? So I think that is a big component of it, is knowing your kid and knowing what really authentically excites them. And maybe they're great at connecting people. Maybe they love animals and nature and being outside, right? And I made this mistake as a parent. Anytime my kid expressed interest in something, I'd be like, oh, yeah, let's do it. Let's get you that skateboard. And come on, we're going to go to the skate park. And I would kind of ruin it for them sometimes. So I would say to parents, just like, watch and don't take over. That was me. So.
Right. Well, but I kind of like the idea of being a tour guide.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Parent is tour guide, guardian is tour guide, where we're just, like, okay, here's a library. Go figure out what you want to read. Here's a museum. Here's all the sports. Here's whatever it is. And then here's skateboarding, and then and you kind of introduce them to the different things. Yeah. But tour guide there's less pressure with that word.
Yeah.
Sure.
Like it's a little tour of life, and you
you
figure out what you want to do.
And letting them cultivate what's actually interesting.
Okay, tattoos. Did not see that coming, but it's all right.
Yeah,
sure,
absolutely. All right. Parents often reach out asking what the schools are doing about certain behaviors that students engage in outside of school. What are the boundaries between what schools can reasonably provide and what families should be responsible for? And how can we respond to parents who are clearly hurting when they blame the schools or want schools to solve their problems?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it really touches on, I'll say what I hear in that is I think there is a deep desire for communal support when it comes to parenting, and unfortunately, we cannot be around our children all the time, and we have to trust others with their lives, really, and what's influencing around them. So as soon as they leave home, we can't control that influence, and that is inherently scary. The way our culture is set up is schools are kind of where they go. So we are putting a lot of trust in the school system to take care of our children and make sure they're being influenced in the right ways. So when something comes up and something happens and your child does something you're not expecting them to do and doesn't feel right to you, it makes sense why we're going to look for an answer, and that's most likely going to be the school. We trusted you with our children. Our children are acting out of the norm, out of what we're used to, and it's easy to look for blame. And I think not that we can't have those discussions over where those lines are and when the schools should step in, but at the same time, the schools are there to educate, and there has to be some limitation on that too. They can't, we wouldn't want them to overstep and start controlling kids outside of school either. So what I hear in there is just this need for trust within the community, trust with others, that when I send my kid out there, I want to know that they will be safe and they will be protected, and that is not always something we can rely on. And so when it comes to that, those spheres of influence and knowing kind of how children are influenced at school and what factors might be there, all we can really trust and is how we influence them at home. Just going back to that knowing your kid part of the conversation already, and that's just, and it's building trust is the kind of the key part to that, because you can't really demand trust. You can't demand that I trust you. You have to build that trust, and the more that trust is felt between parent and child, I feel like the easier it is to have those understandings of, okay, why did you do what you did, and what do we need to change about home to help answer that, or whatever it may be.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, especially I think in cases, the ones that surprise me the most are when something happens and it's not even at school.
Right.
You know, my child did this with a friend, outside of school. What are you going to do about it at school? And I understand in these conversations, the parent is coming because, they're having these conversations with the staff or other parents who they think can help because they're worried. They're concerned. And so I know it's coming from, they're not thinking of it as blame. They're thinking, help.
Yeah. I think it's really a balance between, kids are needing and wanting more independence, and parents want our kids to be safe and be okay. So how do we balance that? Because it's really important to recognize both things. And you're right, when parents are worried and scared, they're often not in the best state of mind. I've been there. And I don't know about you, but in my experience, parenting is hard and it's scary. And sometimes I felt really alone, and I felt desperate for help. Tell me what to do and I'll do it, right? So I get that. And that's why, here I go on my soapbox, the best thing that families can do, like actually in research, the most significant factor in helping kids face adversity and cope with stress is having a good relationship with their primary caregivers. And that rests on the primary caregiver's psychological health. So what that looks like is getting support, parents getting support, talking to a friend, having like a go-to person that you call when something really hard happens, having counseling or therapy if you can access it. There's groups. We do counseling for parents at BYS that's free. We do parent groups. Sign up for that. There's some great books and podcasts, but get support. Like, take care of yourself first, because that literally is the best thing first that you can do for your kids.
And I think that permeates through all of our questions here. I think the more support that parents feel, the easier all of this stuff kind of gets.
Right. I remember reading once, it was, I think he was a minister who was very immersed in kind of Eastern thinking, and an Episcopalian minister, and he talked about sometimes the way we figure out who we are is to figure out who we aren't. And that was one of the best things I ever read, just in terms of kind of relaxing and letting, not just my kids, but me. Sometimes you say or do something, and then later you think, that didn't really feel right. That's not who I want to be. And it kind of takes that pressure off. And then I think, like you said, just the idea that it's not just me. I'm not alone in this. There's other people going through this. And I think it can be easy to want to, have this image of, no, I've got it all together. Or even sometimes I think, I don't want to burden other people.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't want, I need to take care of this myself. And actually something you said earlier, Helen, it was a different question, but I just remembered my husband, I was probably like 35, and he said, "What do you want?" And I was like, "What? What does that mean?" Like, it's like, well, no, what do my kids want or need? What is, what do you need? What does my family need? What does the dog need? Sometimes I think we sort of put ourselves, and that was such a powerful question. And so even now I'll be like, okay, what do I want here?
Yes.
It's not selfish. It's necessary.
And it's modeling for your kids, right? They're seeing who you are. Like, yes, as a parent, that takes up a big part of our identity, but that's not all of it, right? So your kids get to see you. Oh, there's mom. They don't need you to be good. They need you to be real.
Right. And something like that showing them when you ask for help allows them to learn to ask for help themselves. Because I hear sometimes with parents, why didn't my kid come to me with this? Why didn't they trust me? And a lot of times it's that they didn't learn the language to how to talk about how they're feeling, what's going on. We all kind of learn to keep our heads down and keep going, and kids pick up on that real quick. So they learn, well, I don't see anyone else asking for help, so I shouldn't be doing it either. Right. So when you take those moments to, look for support somewhere, do something for yourself, that kind of those self-care things for yourself, kids will pick up on that quick, and they start to incorporate it into their own lives. Which
is so good. And it's not even necessarily emotional things. It can be our psychological health. I honestly didn't know I could ask teachers for help. I thought, and I look at my daughter doing so well in math now, my youngest, and actually all of them, they learned how to ask for help. And I think back to, I thought, I guess I don't know this, and that was, I don't know if that's everybody or if that was just me, but, just there's, that was a lesson I learned in college was, this is a really difficult subject. And then I learned about, they have sessions, these professors and their TAs, and you can go get help, and they pretty much tell you everything you need to know. And I was like, what?
Right.
This was the thing. So,
yeah, I think that willingness to ask for help is so important. Like, it's a skill that we all need in life, and it's modeled. It starts at home. So when you talk about, if your kids ask you about your marriage or about being a parent, be honest and say, I love it. It's great. And it's really hard. And I work at it. And here's where I get extra support. Right. So I think that, and kids love to hear about how imperfectly human we are as parents, I think.
I don't think there's any mysteries about that anymore after right. COVID and being, Yeah. So another thing I wanted to touch on was, how do you know what behaviors are normal and when you need to, take it up to the next level, when you need to get help for your kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I'll start with saying that really this is an inherently difficult time. If you're a parent of teens, they are changing a lot, and there's a lot of new developments, and there's a lot of personality shifts and everything as they're really forming their identity at this point in their life. So change inherently isn't an indicator of there's a problem here. Sometimes it definitely can be. It's more about how that change is impacting the child, if they're starting to enjoy things they liked less, or if they're enjoying things they like less but then developing new hobbies, that's one thing. But if they're just kind of maybe checking out of their social life. This developmentally, that being a teen is, your social life is kind of the most important thing, as we all know and we've all experienced before. If they're kind of starting to disconnect from that in some real ways, I'd say that's maybe the first big indicator for me. I don't know.
Yeah. Again, I think it's knowing your kid and noticing something that feels like a real shift for them, out of character, maybe spending a lot more time on their own, or withdrawing, or avoiding things. And then I think the first step is to check in with them. Well, actually, the first step is to check in with yourself for parents, I think. Again, like, what is my own anxiety, and how do I manage that so it doesn't kind of leak onto my kid? And then just go to your kid and say, I noticed lately that you're spending a lot more time in your room. I just wanted to check in. How are you doing? Just an open-ended, I notice this, like, I see what's happening.
And they might not have the words to respond right away, because this is can be a very new thing. So allowing them that grace, a little bit of independence to figure out for themselves how to communicate best with you, what their needs are in those moments.
Right. And then I think for parents to think about having like a safety net for their kids and building that safety net not when it's a crisis, but before you get to the crisis. And I think the elements of a safety net are having a doctor, having a primary care provider. And I know that can be really hard right now, and yet there are wait lists, but making sure you have, like, if you need to call the doctor, you have one. You have an established relationship. Having other trusted adults in their life. It could be other teachers. It could be coaches. It could be aunts or uncles or neighbors. But sometimes our kids just can't tell us things. We're parents. I mean, that's really normal. I think we've maybe all experienced that growing up. Maybe a therapist. If your kid's open to therapy and it's not just because you say, hey, I went to therapy and this was really helpful and I wonder if you're interested. And if they are, great. Have them get in touch with BYS or if you want to set that up. But if they're not interested, that's okay too. But I think building this safety net so that if you notice something, if your sort of internal alert system, your gut, as a parent who knows this kid is saying, there's really something going on, you have that to draw from, that support.
Yeah. And just remember, it's not always when those alarm systems go off, it's not always the worst case scenario.
Right.
And that's when it comes in, checking with yourself first and then checking in with them. Yeah. Because really getting a clear picture of what's going on can only help both of you in those situations.
Right. No, I really like that advice to start with you to make sure you're not confusing what you want for your child. Like maybe they are figuring out who they are, and so the fact that they're not going to as many parties is actually them saying, hey, I'm an introvert, turns out, you know, and that wears me out. And so it's not your idea of who they should be.
Yeah.
Right.
That's at stake.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think in doing that, talking to a close friend, being like someone who you can really be honest with, hey, I'm worried about my kid in this way, just to talk about it with someone, or call BYS. We could do like a one-off parent one-on-one session and just talk through some things because it helps to get it out of your head. I don't know, in the middle of the night when I'm worried and I'm going down the road about this, this is going to happen and then their life's going to be ruined right. and it's going to be horrible and, so it's good to get that out. Get a reality check.
Definitely.
Yeah, because we love our kids.
Yes, we do.
Bottom line.
We're all doing our best.
Yes.
That's all any of us can do. So remembering that throughout all of this.
I'm so glad we got to have this conversation.
Yeah.
And I think we might be getting to the end.
We are. Thank you so much, Shannon, Chase, and Helen, for allowing us to be part of your conversation and to learn from your responses and questions. Thank you all who have joined us. We hope that this conversation proves to be of benefit to you in your parenting, and we leave you with the foundation that healthy youth begin with healthy families, and healthy families create healthy communities. BYS is a nonprofit organization that is supported by community members like you. For more information, please visit AskBYS.org. We thank Milagro Castilleja for producing our show. Another big thanks to Barn, the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network, for their generosity in allowing us to record in their media arts studio.